slaves flowed through the marketplace at Ephesus like olive oil through Seville. The brutal truth was that many Romans wouldn't have seen much of a distinction between the two. As they saw it, slaves were one of the products of empire.
For centuries, historians have tried to bury Rome's darkest secrets. Boys stolen as spoils of war had their innocence ripped away, forced into lives of fear, control, and unimaginable cruelty. They became prized possessions of the powerful, trapped in a world no one dared to describe. What was it truly like to live as a male concubine 3,000 years ago? Join us as we expose the hidden horrors of these enslaved youths in ancient Rome. The role of the delicatus. Rome in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE was a world of stark contradictions. It spoke proudly of law and order, yet its empire was built on conquest and domination.
May Jupiter and Venus bless the Vinalia and honor these games.
It praised the sanctity of family, yet indulged in excess that mocked its own ideals. Philosophers spoke of human dignity,
soldiers from their families and friends.
But the empire thrived on a system that reduced human lives to mere property. At the core of this system stood one of its darkest creations, the delicatus. This word described a young male slave chosen not for strength or skill, but for beauty and refinement. In the eyes of the Roman elite, these boys were not children with futures. They were possessions, no different from cattle or furniture, valued only for their appearance and the pleasure they could provide. Slavery in Rome was not defined by race. Captives came from every corner of the empire: Gaul, Germania, Britannia, and the East. Among them, boys between 7 and 14 were singled out if they fit Roman ideals of beauty. Their fate was unlike any other. At the Forum Boarium along the Tiber, these boys stood on platforms while placards declared their origin, age, and condition. Buyers inspected them one by one. Greek, Thracian, Syrian, and Phrygian children fetched the highest sums, their features seen as especially desirable. But how were these best boys selected, and what followed once they were bought? Training the perfect delicatus. The Roman slave markets worked with cold efficiency. In Delos, Rome, and across the empire, traders and buyers sought out individuals with smooth skin, delicate features, wide eyes, and slender frames. These young boys who had seen their villages destroyed, their fathers unalived, and their mothers enslaved will have to stand stripped and exposed, their bodies handled, their teeth examined, and their price decided. Some were bought quickly. Others endured repeated sales, each one stripping away another piece of who they once were. Purchase marked only the beginning. A new identity was forced on them at once. Their old names were erased, replaced with softened Roman ones that emphasized submission. Their native languages were banned. Their culture was cut away until nothing remained but the role their master demanded. This transformation extended to the body. Hair was plucked or burned away with resin. Pale skin was enforced by confinement indoors and by the daily application of white lead powder, a poison disguised as beauty. Food was rationed carefully to keep their frames slight and childlike well into adolescence. Some endured far worse. Castration, though officially outlawed, was carried out in secret to preserve a boyish form. The act robbed them of the chance to become men, locking them in perpetual youth. Roman writers often mocked the East for its use of eunuchs or spadones, branding them effeminate. Yet Rome's own elite households were full of them. Laws forbidding the practice were ignored whenever wealth and status demanded exceptions. The making of a delicatus went beyond reshaping the body. It extended into the mind. These boys were trained in poetry, music, and dance, not for their own personal growth, but to entertain and please others. They were taught to sense moods, offer flattery, and conceal their own thoughts. Failure brought swift punishment, beatings, hunger, or isolation. And yet, this was only a glimpse of the torment they endured every single day. Endless torment on earth. Once these young boys entered their master's household, their lives were tightly controlled from dawn until night. Each day began before sunrise with long hours of grooming, hair styled with care, faces painted with cosmetics, bodies rubbed with oils, and clothing chosen in bright colors to display their value. Some wore jewelry or golden collars, which served as both decoration and proof of ownership. Their training revolved around serving pleasure, but at night, they were most vulnerable. Ancient writers used soft language, yet evidence is clear. These boys were repeatedly abused. Classified as property, they had no right to refuse. No silk tunic or golden collar could hide the scars of constant exploitation. Medical writers like Galen and Celsus even recorded injuries from such abuse, treating broken bodies as curiosities rather than crimes. Roman society normalized its suffering. Frescoes and mosaics celebrated their beauty, while poets praised their charm. Myths of Ganymede or Hyacinthus provided divine cover for exploitation. Even their names were sometimes borrowed from myth, stripping away individuality. The language of the time reduced them to delights, or boys, never referring to them as people. Those who pleased their masters received small rewards. A delicatus might wear silk while others wore rags, or taste fine food while field slaves ate gruel. Yet these privileges were hollow. They remained slaves, unable to refuse, unable to leave, unable even to claim ownership of their own bodies. When they aged out of desirability, grim futures awaited. Many were sold to brothels, while others were reduced to being servants, constant reminders of the youth that had vanished. A few gained freedom, but freedom rarely meant peace. Trained only to serve, burdened with trauma, they often lived in isolation. Archaeology confirms the weight of these lives. Burials of young slaves included mirrors, cosmetics, and jewelry, signs of identities built on appearance. In Pompeii and Herculaneum, rooms decorated with erotic art reveal where they lived, staged for constant display. Medical texts acknowledge the cost: injuries from abuse, infections, castration, and even. But such knowledge never brought protection. It was used only to preserve value, reducing human pain to maintain property. For those chosen to serve in the emperor's palace, the demands grew even darker. The cruel emperors of Capri. When Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, passed away in 14 AD, the empire passed to his stepson, Tiberius Caesar. For years, he maintained stability across Rome's vast territories, upheld law and order, and expanded the empire's frontiers. Yet the burden of power weighed heavily on him. He despised flattery, mistrusted the Senate, and feared betrayal at every corner. His suspicion of rivals deepened with time, turning Rome's political life into a battlefield of paranoia. By the end of his second decade on the throne, Tiberius had grown weary of public life and the suffocating intrigues of the capital. In 26 AD, he made a fateful decision. He abandoned Rome. Leaving the daily business of government to his ministers, he withdrew to Capri, a rocky island rising from the Tyrrhenian Sea. There, high on the cliffs, he built the magnificent Villa Jovis, a sprawling palace with panoramic views of the Mediterranean. To visitors, it was the retreat of a ruler seeking peace. To those who entered its gates, it became something far darker. Ancient historians describe Capri as a place where the emperor's worst instincts were unleashed. Safe from senators and the judgment of Rome, Tiberius surrounded himself with boys and youths drawn from across the empire. Some were noble-born, sent under pressure to serve the emperor. Others were enslaved provincials, torn from their homes. Once inside the villa, they were at the emperor's mercy. According to these accounts, Tiberius devised cruel games that blurred the line between innocence and humiliation. The most infamous story tells of the so-called minnows, children forced to swim between his legs in the bath, trained to perform as if part of some grotesque ritual. As Tiberius aged, his health declined and his appetites twisted. Writers claim he surrounded himself with erotic art, frescoes, statues, and even rare manuals of sexual technique by the poetess Elephantis. These filled his villa, decorating the walls where boys lived and served. Tiberius allegedly staged live performances using his attendants as actors. Accounts describe young males costumed for obscene plays, forced to enact myths before the emperor and his guests. To later Romans, Capri was less a villa than a private theater of exploitation, where the world's most powerful man turned innocence into spectacle. By the time Tiberius passed in 37 AD, Rome had grown to despise him. When word reached the capital, the people took to the streets to celebrate. For them, the once capable ruler had become a recluse whose depravity tainted the imperial throne. Tiberius's chosen successor was Gaius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, better known by the nickname Caligula. Initially, his arrival was met with joy. The son of the beloved general Germanicus, Caligula symbolized hope after years of secrecy and suspicion. Rome cheered him as a savior, believing a golden age had begun. That illusion did not last. Within months, Caligula revealed himself as one of the most infamous rulers in history. Caligula had spent 6 years on Capri as Tiberius's ward. There, he had witnessed the emperor's disturbing rituals. When he came to power himself, he carried those lessons back to Rome, but reshaped them with his own cruelty. He summoned boys from noble families, claiming it was an honor to serve the palace. In reality, they were treated as props in his theatrical feasts. At banquets, boys were ordered to sing, dance, or recite, only to be mocked by the emperor. Others were stripped of dignity in front of their peers, turned into the butt of cruel jokes. Caligula's appetites were not confined to banquets. Historians accuse him of surrounding himself with boys in private, degrading them in ways that reminded all of Rome that his authority was absolute. At times, he reportedly threatened sudden violence against attendants, savoring their fear before laughing at their trembling. This unpredictability made life in the palace unbearable. A boy might be summoned to serve wine one evening and humiliated before hundreds the next. For families, resistance was impossible. To object was to invite ruin or execution. Caligula's banquets also blurred the line between celebration and cruelty. Boys were posed as living ornaments, forced to stand motionless for hours. Others carried endless trays of wine until they collapsed from exhaustion. What seemed to outsiders like magnificent imperial feasts were, for those within, spectacles of humiliation. Caligula's reign lasted only 4 years, yet his cruelty etched itself into Rome's memory. He turned the palace into a stage where innocence was mocked, fear weaponized, and the young reduced to toys of imperial amusement. His assassination in 41 AD brought relief, but it did not end the cycle of torment for enslaved young males. The boy who became an empress. If Caligula represented cruelty through humiliation, Nero embodied corruption through obsession. His reign, from 54 to 68 AD, is remembered for tyranny, extravagance, and the Great Fire. But among his many scandals, one story stands apart: the tragic fate of a boy named Sporus. In 65 AD, Nero's wife, Poppaea Sabina, passed away, either from illness or, as some sources allege, from a violent blow delivered by the emperor. In the aftermath, Nero encountered Sporus, a youth who bore a striking resemblance to the empress. Fascinated, Nero ordered him castrated, dressed him in imperial clothing, and staged a wedding ceremony in which he publicly married the boy. Before crowds in Rome and Greece, Sporus was paraded as Sabina reborn. Sporus became a prisoner of spectacle. Draped in silks adorned with jewels, he rode beside Nero in a litter, kissed by the emperor in public, forced to act the part of empress. Behind the outward splendor, his life was one of humiliation, a boy reshaped into a symbol of Nero's grief and delusion. Some historians suggest that political motives were at play. By transforming Sporus into Sabina, Nero may have aimed to neutralize potential dynastic threats. But whatever the calculation, the boy's individuality was erased. He existed only as the emperor's living illusion. After Nero's downfall in 68 AD, Sporus was passed from one ruler to another. Eventually, the emperor Vitellius sought to force him into a public play reenacting the rape of Persephone, a cruel parody of the boy's own life. Rather than endure this final humiliation, Sporus chose death. He ended his life at barely 20 years old. Many believed that after seeing a freeborn boy stripped of his identity and forced to live as another's shadow, Rome might finally awaken to the cruelty inflicted on its young males. But such hope was nothing more than a dream. The Emperor's Show. When Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, passed away in 180 AD, Romans hoped his son Commodus would carry on his legacy. Instead, they found themselves ruled by a man consumed by vanity and a desire for spectacle. Commodus was only 18 when he became emperor. Unlike his father, he had little interest in governance. He preferred games, feasts, and the arena. His reign quickly turned into a carnival of indulgence, with boys caught in its orbit. Sources describe how Commodus gathered groups of youths, slaves, captives, and even the sons of powerless families to take part in his rituals and entertainments. When he entered the Colosseum, he did not appear as an emperor, but as a gladiator, turning combat into a theatrical spectacle. Boys were often forced into these performances, carrying bloodied swords, marching in costume behind him, or playing comic roles designed to exaggerate his triumph. Violence was never absent. Ancient writers recall how Commodus staged mock punishments, frightening boys with threats of death before sparing them for the amusement of the crowd. Their fear, to him, was another form of spectacle. After 12 years of chaos, Commodus was strangled in his bath in 192 AD. However, of all Rome's emperors, none blurred the line between power and spectacle like Elagabalus. Crowned in 218 AD at just 14, he brought not stability, but chaos. Unlike Tiberius, Caligula, or Commodus, his reign was not defined by hidden cruelty or calculated terror, but by scandalous performances that turned the empire into an unwilling audience. Raised in Syria as a priest of the sun god Elagabal, the young emperor carried his deity to Rome and demanded that it replace Jupiter at the head of the pantheon. He built a grand temple and appeared in jeweled robes as the living high priest. In his palace, every banquet and ritual became an extension of this theater. Boys and girls alike were forced into roles, costumed, painted, adorned, and made to serve as props in his pageantry. Unlike Caligula's cruelty or Commodus's games, Elagabalus staged humiliation as theater. Boys were made to crawl while serving food, to stagger under trays too heavy for their strength, or to perform degrading dances while guests laughed. A senator could be forced to watch as his child was mocked before the emperor. Religion itself became a stage. Boys dressed as miniature priests, carrying sacred symbols and bizarre rites that outraged Rome's elite. The Senate saw in Elagabalus not only immorality, but sacrilege. His unpredictable demands, his foreign rituals, and his exploitation of attendants alienated even his own family. In 222 AD, at just 18, he was assassinated by his guards. His mutilated body, dragged through the streets, symbolized Rome's rejection of an emperor who had turned rulership into chaos. Before his death, Elagabalus is said to have married a male athlete named Delicatus in a formal ceremony in Rome. For countless boys drawn into the imperial palaces, life remained a waking nightmare. But among them, one young enslaved boy would experience a fate unlike any other. The Emperor's Muse. The first time Emperor Hadrian crossed paths with Antinous was during one of his long tours of the empire. In June 123 CE, he visited Claudiopolis, a small city in Bithynia. Most scholars believe this is where their story began. At first, Hadrian likely did not take him as a lover. Instead, Antinous was sent to Rome, where he trained at the imperial school on the Caelian Hill, where boys selected for the household were trained. Here, under strict supervision, he would have been taught language, manners, and the arts of serving an emperor. While Hadrian continued his journeys, Antinous was being shaped into a companion worthy of an emperor's notice. By 125 CE, Hadrian returned to Italy and settled into his villa at Tibur. Over the next 3 years, Antinous became part of his private retinue. By the time Hadrian left again, this time for Greece, the boy was no longer just another page in the palace. He had become Hadrian's favorite, his closest companion, and soon his lover. Antinous was young, perhaps in his mid-teens when he entered Hadrian's circle, while the emperor was in his 50s. To Roman eyes, Antinous was not simply a companion. He was a possession, a living jewel that adorned the emperor's life. Hadrian was married to Empress Sabina, but theirs was a loveless match. He showed no desire for women, and all accounts agree that he preferred the company of boys and young men. In Antinous, however, he found more than physical beauty. Writers describe the boy as intelligent, gentle, and quiet, a figure who soothed the emperor's restless spirit. They hunted, prayed, and traveled together. Hadrian even wrote poems for him, though none survive. Their bond was evident to everyone at court. Antinous was always at Hadrian's side during ceremonies, on hunts, and even in religious rites. He was there in 128 CE, when Hadrian laid the foundation stone for the Temple of Venus in Rome, and later when the emperor was initiated into the sacred mysteries of Eleusis in Athens. The two were inseparable, their closeness undeniable, even scandalous. But Antinous had little power in this relationship. Unlike an empress or a senator, he had no title, no official role. He lived at Hadrian's side because the emperor willed it so. He could not refuse his place, nor escape it. His life was both privileged and bound. He ate fine foods, wore silks, and traveled across the empire, but always as Hadrian's concubine, his delight, his property. As Antinous grew older, the dynamic between them shifted. A famous scene illustrates this change. In 130 CE, Hadrian and Antinous traveled to Libya to hunt a lion that was terrorizing the villagers. The hunt turned dangerous, and Hadrian claimed to have saved Antinous' life. The emperor spread the story far and wide. Poems were written, medallions struck, and art commissioned. Yet in one carving, Antinous is no longer a boy. His body is stronger, his face more mature, his presence less submissive. The balance of their bond was beginning to change. In the autumn of 130 CE, Hadrian and his court set sail on the Nile. The emperor was ill, troubled by both physical pain and a restless spirit. Antinous was there as always, silent at his side. But in October, near the festival of Osiris, disaster struck. Antinous fell into the river and drowned. The exact cause of his passing remains a mystery. Some whispered that rivals had murdered him at court, though Antinous had no real influence to threaten them. Others claimed Hadrian took his life in anger, but this seems unlikely given the emperor's devastation. Another theory is that Antinous offered himself as a sacrifice, believing that his passing could restore Hadrian's health. Others still argue it was a tragic accident, perhaps caused by drink. Whatever the truth, Hadrian was consumed by grief. Ancient writers recorded that he wept like a woman. For a Roman emperor, such public mourning was shocking. He refused to let the boy be forgotten. In Egypt, priests declared Antinous a god, linking him with Osiris, the god of rebirth. Hadrian embraced this and went further. He proclaimed Antinous divine, built a city in his name on the very spot where he had died, and ordered statues of him to be carved across the empire. This act was extraordinary. Rome reserved deification for emperors and their families, never for favorites or concubines. But Hadrian broke tradition. Soon, the cult of Antinous spread like wildfire. In Greece, he was honored as a new Dionysus. In Egypt, he was worshipped as a local god who brought healing and rebirth. In the West, he was linked to the sun god Balanos. Games were held in his honor, festivals established in his memory. His face became one of the most reproduced in the ancient world, serene, youthful, forever beautiful. The grief-stricken emperor even found Antinous in the stars. He named a constellation after him, placed beside the mighty eagle of Zeus, so that the boy would shine eternally in the night sky. Hadrian's devotion startled and unsettled Rome. Senators whispered their mockery, citizens questioned his judgment, yet the emperor remained unconcerned. His fascination with younger men was rooted in an older, deeply ingrained tradition of ancient Greece. But in that earlier age, such relationships followed very different rules and social expectations. The male concubines of Greece. In ancient Greece, concubinage was a common feature of elite society. Prominent men might maintain one or several male concubines, depending on their status and wealth. Like in Rome, these relationships were rarely based on love or mutual respect. Instead, they were expressions of dominance. The older, free-born male assumed authority, while the younger male, often a slave or a lower-status individual, occupied a subordinate position. A man who faced social stigma in the passive role, while the dominant partner incurred none. Ideally, the elder provided mentorship or guidance in exchange for companionship. In practice, many young males, often referred to as catamites, were kept primarily for the pleasure or service of their patrons. Classical literature, including Plato, suggests that these arrangements were widespread, although their social perception varied by region and period. Attitudes toward pederasty were not uniform. In Sparta, relationships between older and younger males were institutionalized, often linked to military mentorship and civic duty, and formed part of elite education. Athens, by contrast, increasingly regarded such practices as outdated or morally questionable. Laws attempted to limit adult males' exploitation of younger partners, though enforcement was inconsistent, leaving many loopholes. Young male attendants fulfilled multiple roles, serving as performers, entertainers, and companions in domestic rituals. Their status reflected that of the household. Elite families offered greater opportunities for display and indulgence. Male concubines, like their Roman counterparts, were often the property of influential men, leaving them with little legal protection. Freeborn males could invoke laws such as the Lex Scantinia, which penalized violations against other freeborn males. Still, slaves and dependents had no such rights. Their bodies were subject to their master's desires. It was within this context that the Roman term delicatus emerged. Greek conceptions of gender and sexuality also significantly influenced these practices. Men and boys participated in festivals, processions, and public entertainments that involved costume, role-playing, or cross-dressing. Myth and religious imagery reflected a fluid approach to gender. Zeus engaged lovers of both sexes, sometimes adopting female forms, and Hermaphroditus embodied a blending of male and female characteristics. Such cultural touchstones normalized same relationships, though always within defined hierarchies. Despite these norms, distinctions existed between socially sanctioned behavior and exploitation. Elite men could exercise authority over slaves and lower-status youths with little consequence, but freeborn males retained legal protections. Boys of status sometimes wore the toga praetexta, or a bulla, to signal inviolability. Slaves, in contrast, had no protections, allowing them to serve as attendants, companions, or entertainers regardless of age. The combination of mentorship, dominance, and performative display defined the lives of male concubines. Their existence reinforced social hierarchies, demonstrated wealth, and provided entertainment, but also made them vulnerable to coercion, humiliation, and exploitation. Power and status governed every interaction. These youths were never equals, their roles dictated entirely by the authority and desires of their patrons. As Greek culture merged with Roman norms and later Christian moral frameworks, attitudes toward male concubinage shifted. Practices once socially accepted became increasingly stigmatized. By the late imperial period, legal and cultural protections for freeborn youth had been strengthened, and public displays of such arrangements had fallen out of favor. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.